Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel. Thank you for finding me in this crowded orchid YouTube world. Here I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids in Melbourne, here in Australia, without the help of greenhouses or grow lights or humidifiers or any equipment, really just me and them, outside or inside or not at all. So, if that sounds like your growing conditions and you might be vaguely interested, do hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday, but I am an amateur. And today's amateur rambling is about something that I've never been able to bloom before, although that's a lie because, anyway, we'll get to that. And this is Bifrenaria. And this one isn't Bifrenaria harrisoniae, which is sort of more commonly found in cultivation. This one, and I hadn't actually checked the label because I thought it was harrisoniae, is tyrianthina, Bifrenella tyrianthina. Lots of unpacking to do about this baby, but also this, its cousin, which is also a Bifrenaria. Look how different they are. This has been named and renamed many times, but they happen to be in bloom at the same time, which is great. So we're not really going to look at this because I've done a video about this before, which is Bifrenaria aureofulva, but I just wanted to bring it into the shot because it's from the same family and it's in bloom right now, and it is completely different. Back to the piece, the main piece of the story, which is this. Look at those blooms, look at that plant, finally. Now I do have Bifrenaria harrisoniae, and it was a smallish division and it's just taken forever to really do anything. And I kind of gave up on it. And this one I came across as a much larger plant and thought, you know what? This is kind of my new mantra, which is go for the biggies because small divisions, seedlings, it can just take forever. Anyway, so I decided to buy this very, very healthy division just over a year ago. And look what it has done. It has bloomed for me. So what I think we need to do is talk about this plant, where it comes from, and the care I gave it, because plant lovers of the world, it is not that easy to find definitive asterisk, there is no such thing as definitive care instructions for this orchid or harrisoniae. It's very similar conditions. So I've muddled along. I've cobbled together all the information from books, and there's a particular video I'm going to link to, which is not mine, and we'll talk more about it because I am thrilled I've got it to bloom, and now I just want harrisoniae to bloom. That could take some time. But let's start at the very beginning, as we always should, which is the name, Bifrenaria. And then in this case, what have we got here? Tyrianthina, which I think is how we're pronouncing that. And then there's Bifrenaria aureofulva, and then harrisoniae. So those are the three that I've ever come across, although this one is kind of new into the fold. So the Bifrenaria are all Brazilian and from the East Coast, and depending on the species, just where on the East Coast. So some are southeast and some are further north, some are further inland, some are higher altitude. So quite different geographic locations. And the name, Bifrenaria, so bi means two, and then frenaria is derived from frenum, I think frenum, which is Latin meaning break, and it's to do with some part of the flower in there which has sort of two stripes or two lines deep within the flower. Anyway, that doesn't particularly interest me, but the flower does. But this one, Tyrianthina, so Tyrian purple, does that ring a bell? Yes, that literally means clothed in purple. And if you look at that, it does kind of have that tired lilac-y mauve colour that does come from some of those dyes. Anyway, that's where that comes from. And aureofulva means gold, but fulva comes from fulvus, meaning tawny or yellow. So it's sort of gold yellow, yellow gold, or Bifrenaria yellowy gold. We could translate that as. Anyway, it is quite a specific colour, stunning. And harrisoniae, which I have, but it's not in bloom, and it's a very uninspiring plant at the moment. That was named after a Mr. Harrison who sent the species type back from Brazil to his sister, who bloomed it. So it was named after her. So aureofulva here comes from, as I said, the east coast of Brazil and fairly long stretch of the coast, but slightly higher altitudes and from cooler forests. So it likes to be moist all the time, and it can certainly take my cooler nighttime winter temperatures. And this baby lives outside all year. I've made a video about it, which I'll link. The secret with this one is that I keep it moist all year. Obviously I dial it down in winter, but it doesn't dry out or have a rest for me, and it flowers kind of whenever it wants to. So it's, I think, had at least 3 bursts this year, and it's now early summer, and here we are, the blooms are still there. And now this one, tyrianthina, comes from the northeast of Brazil, so the distribution crosses over with this one, and it grows to a fairly high altitude, but it grows in forests, unlike this one, that does have a distinct dry season, and therein lies one of the tricks I think about growing this well and getting it to bloom. And what I have forgotten to show you is there is a second spike. Look behind you, as they say in pantomimes. There's a second spike there with 2 blooms about to open. And they have both come from older pseudobulbs. So my Bifrenaria journey started with Bifrenaria harrisoniae, which I bought, as I said, this sort of rather uninspiring division, which is taking a long time to get any oomph on. And I bought it from someone who grows cold. And in Australia, that means outside, undercover all year, but without any heating. So it does mean protection from rain, but it means it does get cold, but it's dry in winter. And his words of wisdom were they can take those kind of conditions. So that's pretty broad. And as we know, dry winter can mean many things. Some plants have a completely hard dormancy in winter with not an ounce of water, like catasetum type of orchids. Others want to be dry-ish, and some you should just water occasionally when they really get shriveled. So tricky to find out what dry rest actually means for your orchid. So why don't we consult some books and just see what they say about Bifrenaria and see if we can cobble together some care info. Now, all of these books are talking about harrisoniae, and I think we can assume that they're going to take similar care. Apparently, there's only a slight difference in the shape of the flower between the 2 species. So I'm not going to get my knickers in so much of a knot about the fact that all these books are referring to a different species. They come from similar areas, I think, although obviously, as they've speciated, they must be from geographically different areas to have developed different traits. Anyway, we don't need to go down that path. Let's just see what the books say. Now this one is interesting. This is J.N. Rentoul, and I've consulted these books many a time. There is 4 volumes, each dealing with various genera of orchids, and this guy was Australian, and he was growing in Australia. And this, I think, was published in the 80s. Yes, published in 1982. There's 4 volumes, and you can still get them from secondhand and vintage book dealers. Growing Orchids, 4 volumes. This is volume 3, Vanda's Dendrobiums and Others, which has quite a few pages on Bifrenaria, which is very interesting because I've never read quite such a lot of information about the orchid. But here's something I wanted to share. If you're sitting comfortably, the most probable time for flowering will be in the late Australian spring to early autumn. So late spring or when these spikes emerged, it's now early summer, and the flowers do last a long time. So that makes sense. During the growth stage, the plants should be kept wet and supplied with fertilizers. And considering the root system and the extended period of dormancy, clay pots might have a lot to recommend them. During the whole of the dormant spell, the plants need never be watered, and the pots will take up some moisture by capillary action. So, first info cab off the rank is a relatively hard, dry dormancy. So I decided to not water mine at all. Now it did get some ambient moisture, and the point in the book is that terracotta does absorb ambient moisture. So the roots are going to be able to have access to some moisture, but they are not wet, and the medium certainly isn't wet. But the minute that the temperature warms up, I started to water this. So I actually treated it a lot like my Australian Cymbidium canaliculatum, which also wanted no water throughout winter. So yeah, they're actually hanging in the same place and given fairly similar treatment, although I did start to water this sooner in the year. Now, another interesting insight, you can see that even the new leaves have got lots of sort of markings and brown speckles, a little like zygopedilums, you know, one of those plants that the leaves always look a little bit scabby. Look at that. Oh, the flower's beautiful. So let's just see what Mr. Rentoul says about that. Most of the flowering plants exhibited at society meetings or shows look extremely poor with sunburnt and badly marked foliage, but it would appear that this is the only condition in which the plants may be forced to flower. I don't like the word forced. I think the plant wants to flower, but those are the conditions that it likes, which is bright light, but the leaves are going to show the fact that they are close to the sun and getting a little bit sunburnt. So That was reassuring, that your leaves are not going to look pristine and fabulous, although I'm sure some people's do, but mine certainly don't. But the plant is very happy. Now, interestingly, Mr. Rentoul then goes on to kind of contradict himself, and the last paragraph I think is really interesting. The obvious lesson is, of course, that no one really is able to put a program on paper for the cultivation of any orchid. The ultimate success or failure of any grower is largely dictated by willingness to experiment and improvise. Obeying the ground rules for building a collection suited to the climate from which they come and the climate in which they are expected to continue growing, regardless of the species or hybrid status. Aha! Interesting, because as we know, we are all looking for the golden ticket, the one solution to growing everything, and quite simply, as he says, there isn't. So let me now allude to the video. So you probably are aware of a channel called Howard's Orchids, and Howard is in Cambridgeshire in Britain, and he grows in a greenhouse. But strangely enough, although his plants are in a greenhouse all year, the temperatures are probably not dissimilar to mine, in that his greenhouse obviously doesn't freeze, but it can get, you know, quite cool. And it doesn't get that hot because it's Britain. So actually he grows some very similar things to me, and I love his videos. Now, Howard made a video about his Bifrenaria and that he had divided it and it sulked for years and years, but he makes the point there about giving it a hard winter dormancy. And I followed his advice because I watched that video before winter. So advice taken, flowers produced. I'll link Howard's channel so you can have a look at it. He hasn't posted in a while, which always makes one concerned, but I hope all's well. But he's got an amazing catalogue of videos. So if your conditions are similar, then do have a look. So thank you, Howard, because your tips about winter dormancy, I think, made the difference for me. So there we have two very different care conditions. This one comes from moister, high altitude forests where it's wet all the time. The plant doesn't want to dry out. This one comes from forests which do have a distinct dry season, so it does need to have water held back to really maximize its growth and enable it to flower. Now, another book, Orchids, A Practical Guide for Gardeners, Brian and Vilma Ritterhausen, brother and sister, not husband and wife, as I thought. They just have a very brief mention, which is, they say, about Bifrenaria harrisoniae. This species can be grown with comparative ease and blooms regularly in late summer, thus making it an ideal orchid to grow even for the relatively inexperienced orchid grower. Allow the plants to dry out while resting in winter. Water should be given during this time only if the plants shrivel. Good advice, and if you've got a terracotta pot, that will probably take care of that shriveling problem. And the last book, Exotic Orchids in Australia by David L. Jones. This is an older book, which I think you can still get from secondhand bookshops. His take on Bifrenaria, which again is talking about harrisoniae, but I think we can assume similar care for this, which is they are relatively easy to grow, but can suffer a setback from repotting and hence should be repotted only when absolutely necessary. And that's the point Howard makes in his video. He repotted it, the plant sulked for a long time before it bloomed again. Now this was a very large division, as you can see, and I think I received it bare rooted. I think I got it from eBay if my mind is not playing tricks on me. And it's taken a year to sort of settle in, but it's bloomed in the season that it should. So I don't think that's much of a sulk, about as much as a sulk as you'd get from a Cymbidium or a Phylogeny. So who knows? My harrisoniae, however, I have put that, it's in a pot that's slightly too big, I think, and given these are all epiphytes or lithophytes, you know, they like to be fairly constrained in their pot. However, to that point, you don't want to repot them unnecessarily. So I potted it actually in the same size pot as this, but it's a much smaller plant, and I think it's just going to take a long time. And J.N. Rentoul makes the point that his didn't flower until the plant had actually filled the container that he'd potted it in, and he had put his in a wooden basket, and he allowed the plant to then grow over it, and the basket disintegrated, but the plant sort of maintained its size. But it wasn't until it had filled that vessel that it flowered. So I think I've got years until my harrisoniae blooms, but never mind, we've got this one. So there we go. There's some of those random bits of information that can help you figure out what to do with yours. The other point that one of those books makes is that the roots are, and you can see them here, quite vigorous, quite strong, and not dissimilar to Cymbidiums. And Mr. Rentoul says you can use a cymbidium mix. Now, my cymbidiums I pot in an out-of-the-bag orchid mix, which is sort of medium bark and quite granular. So it's halfway between a regular potting mix and an orchid bark mix. And in this one, I've basically made a version of that. So it's medium-sized bark, and I've put in a little bit of perlite, and I had some, let me just try and fish one out for you. I had some of these little sort of terracotta balls that you can get, and that just helps create spaces between the bark and aerate the mix, and it seems quite healthy and happy. So a largish free draining mix will work for you. Depends how you're growing it though, and depends on your conditions. And then just looking at the form of the plant, so as you can see, very, very strong pseudobulbs with a single leaf. So it looks, I think, not dissimilar to many cotyledons, although they often have two leaves, but very similar look. And then you have the new growth that appears with its new leaf. This then bulks up and matures to become a thick pseudobulb like that. And it seems to me, we live our life like a candle in the wind, that the flower spikes are coming from much older matured bulbs, so not even last year's growth. So that's interesting for me, although actually, who really knows? Anyway, it's certainly coming from a much older matured growth, not from the new growths. And the other thing with a plant with such a thick pseudobulb, it would suggest, of course, that it's very well adept at conserving moisture and food and nutrition in this pseudobulb. It's a great storage vessel, which what they're for. Hence, it can survive through quite rigorous winter dormancies. And if that does become too shriveled, then you would certainly water it. Now, fertilizer-wise, like many things that have a hard dormancy, it's going to want lots of water and food in the period when it is growing, the warmer season. So in spring, topical application of slow-release fertilizer, there's a surprise. And then during the growing season, liquid applications of liquid fertilizers, always diluted down. And I might do that, honestly, outside because I have so many orchids, maybe once every 2 weeks. And I also try to give them a tonic, which is not a fertilizer, it's literally a tonic. And it's more like living fertilizers, I suppose, although it's not a fertilizer. But again, I dial those right down to sort of 1/8, 1/10 of what's recommended. And that's things like seaweed-based solutions or the runoff from worm farms, which is a juice you can dilute and give to plants. Very, very health-giving to the medium that the plant is in. That's fertilizer. So light, as I've said, mine is hanging quite high up and it's getting really bright indirect light all year, even in winter. It's just a lot drier in winter. And then the minute my winter temperatures start to ease off and spring comes, I start to water it a bit more and then really get into it. This time of year, it's going to be quite hot in Melbourne over the next few days. So it's constantly getting bright indirect light. And I think that has really triggered these blooms. Now, the other thing about all of these actually, Bifrenaria, is varying descriptions of their temperature requirements. So when I bought the first one, harrisoniae, it was from a grower who grows it cool, but in a different state to mine. This one came from someone growing in Victoria who also grows it outside cool. And this one, I don't know where I got this from actually, I just decided to give it a go, growing it cool, which means they are outside all year undercover, but they get my winter nighttime minimums, but they're protected from the rain. So they're not wet and cold, which will be death for anything and anyone, including an orchid. And my winter nighttime temperatures can get to sort of 2-3 degrees centigrade, which is the high 30s, low 40s Fahrenheit. So not quite at freezing, just a little bit above, and I don't get frosts. And of course, they're covered over, they're under a polycarbonate roof. So that does offer quite a lot of protection. And so the temperatures is probably at least 1 or 2 degrees warmer under there. But as it's basically dry and dormant, not doing anything, it sails through. And I think given where it's coming from, I think those cooler winter temperatures serve a purpose and a benefit to the plant. So this one, super happy. Now in Howard's case, Howard's orchids in Cambridgeshire, he is growing his in a greenhouse that is heated, but it's heated in winter. So his minimum there is going to be a lot higher than mine. I think his is around 10 degrees centigrade. So like, I don't know, 50, 55 Fahrenheit. But this one, as mine demonstrates, can certainly go lower. Well, now let's talk flowers. Now it's a very sunny, hot day today, and I would have thought the fragrance of which these are supposedly famous for would have started to come out, but no, it actually this makes sense. It has a waxy fragrance, and it's quite a waxy flower. But yeah, not a fragrance that's setting the world on fire for me, but the flowers are really, really, really beautiful, aren't they? So as you can see, tyrianthina means dressed in purple, and it is, although it's kind of more mauvey lilac, isn't it? And it's not a strong colour, but very beautiful, firm, waxy flowers, which are long lasting. You can kind of tell by the flower they're going to be. So I have a spike that's emerged from a much older pseudobulb with 2 buds, and then I have a second spike that's emerged from a different but older spike, and it has 2 buds as well. And they're going to open for me probably any minute, I suppose. So I'm going to have 2 spikes with the flowers lasting quite a long time, which is going to bring me a great deal of joy. So there we are, plant lovers, Bifrenaria. I think we've covered everything that I know of anyway that has helped me. Moral of the story, I guess, is don't repot unless you absolutely have to. And with these types, winter dormancy, very important. Maybe not bone dry, maybe the occasional bit of water. Or if it's in a terracotta pot, you can wet the pot and then the plant can absorb moisture from the terracotta rather than watering the thing itself. However, this baby is the outlier, which really doesn't look as though it's remotely related, but it is. And so you can kind of tell they look very different care. This one does want to be kept moist all year, and this one actually does like more shade than this one. But I've made a care video about that, which I've linked. This is a first time bloomer for me, and I am very, very excited. There we are, plant lovers. I hope wherever you are in the world, all is well in your orchid growing environment, and we are heading into the new year. I'm not quite sure when I'm going to post this, so it might be the new year, it might not. Anyway, if it's not, happy Christmas, and if it is, happy new year. Either way, let's see what 2025 brings us. More orchids. I am moving in May of 2025, so I'm already starting to plan that little escapade. Lots of different growing spaces in our new house, so I will try and document it, but it might just be too much trouble and too stressful to try and film while I'm actually moving, because it's going to be quite laborious and time consuming anyway. We might just do an after the event video about that. Anyway, I'm rambling on. Wherever you are, I hope all's well, and I look forward to seeing you next week with something interesting. And if you want to know what it is, hit subscribe because I post every Friday. But until then, I look forward to seeing you next week.